Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a really fascinating text by Maccoby's Stephen Mapaya called The Foundation to Come. Imagine for a second completely tearing down a nation's economy and just rebuilding the whole thing from scratch. Well, whether you're a hardcore economics nerd or just someone fascinated by massive structural ideas, this framework gives us a super specific, ambitious look at how to entirely reorganize a nation's wealth and labor. Let's get into it. Now, as we go through this, we're going to look at this text purely as an architectural schematic. We're not here to debate the politics. We just want to understand exactly how the author thinks a total shift to a centralized, state-owned model could actually work mechanically in South Africa. Think of it like examining the blueprints for a giant, completely new type of engine. It's just a really interesting mental exercise to see how all these proposed gears and levers are supposed to fit together regardless of where you stand politically. So right off the bat, let's establish the catalyst for this whole proposal. Why even build this new engine? Well, it stems from a pretty stark diagnosis of South Africa's current situation. The author argues that relying on foreign investment and traditional free market principles has, quite frankly, failed to fix the country's huge unemployment and deep social inequality. The text basically says that our current systems just can't create the millions of stable jobs needed to uplift the population. So the author concludes that a massive structural pivot away from the private market isn't just an idea, it's mathematically necessary. To really grasp this proposed solution, we're going to break this blueprint down pillar by pillar. We'll cover 1, the core economic challenge, 2, government-owned production strategies, 3, public housing and communities, 4, reimagining agricultural land, and finally, 5, the projected blueprint outcomes. All right, kicking things off with Section 1, the core economic challenge. So, under this framework, instead of sitting back and waiting for outside investors to magically appear and create jobs, the state literally takes the wheel. It works in 3 steps. First, the government identifies products that are being imported in massive volumes, say millions of consumer electronics or auto parts. Second, rather than giving out tax breaks to tempt a foreign company to build a factory, the state just directly funds and owns the physical factory itself. And third, they partner with foreign companies who come in strictly to manage the day-to-day operations. They bring their high-level industry expertise, but they don't actually own the building. And this creates a pretty fascinating loop, because the government owns the brick-and-mortar infrastructure, it collects the primary revenue from whatever is produced, but instead of that money vanishing into private shareholder dividends, it gets pumped right back into building more infrastructure. This constantly churns out a massive number of local, state-funded jobs. And because private companies are handling the management side, the state gets all that slick, global operational efficiency without ever giving up ownership. It's a real win-win in this model. Moving right along to Section 2, public housing and communities. Now, as you probably know, a huge issue in South Africa is a lack of affordable housing and the growth of informal settlements. This blueprint tackles that with a very strict spatial solution. The idea is to build high-quality, self-contained public housing for low-income workers literally right next door to these new state-owned economic hubs. By physically tying the housing to the job centers, you completely wipe out the massive daily commute. And honestly, transportation can be a huge drain on both time and money for the average working-class person. Remove that commute, and you instantly lower the cost of living and boost a worker's disposable income. But here's where it gets really interesting. It's basically a closed-loop microeconomy. The blueprint states that any business inside these housing communities, like your local grocery store or pharmacy, absolutely cannot be privately owned. They have to be entirely government or community-owned. The whole point here is to make sure every single dollar spent stays right there in the community. All those profits get aggressively reinvested locally to maintain the buildings and upgrade facilities, basically putting up a wall to prevent private owners from extracting wealth out of working-class neighborhoods. Okay, let's shift gears a bit to Section 3, reimagining agricultural land. The author draws a super sharp contrast here when it comes to rural economics. They argue that the current model, which relies heavily on private land ownership, creates a situation that's just ripe for worker exploitation and crazy seasonal job instability. The proposed fix? An uncompromising, complete overhaul. Under this new framework, farmland isn't privately owned at all anymore. Instead, the government takes over, owning and centrally managing all agricultural land nationwide, making sure food production aligns with what the country actually needs rather than just chasing private profit. So what does this actually mean for the workers? Well, by making the state the sole landowner, those seasonal farm workers basically become permanent, salaried government employees. Giving farm workers a stable, guaranteed wage plus access to that public housing we just talked about creates a massive incentive for people to actually want to do agricultural work. The blueprint argues that formalizing farm work like this makes it a highly desirable profession, which, by extension, completely dries up the demand for exploitable, undocumented labor. It's trying to secure the nation's food supply and wipe out the illegal labor shadow economy all at once.
Next up is Section 4, the Socialist City.
Zooming out to the big picture now, the ultimate goal of all this is to totally erase the stark divides between wealthy neighborhoods and informal settlements. To pull this off, the blueprint takes that public-private partnership we saw with the factories and scales it way up. The government essentially becomes a massive nationwide real estate investor, holding a huge portfolio of commercial and residential properties. And this is key to avoiding those clunky bureaucratic housing projects of the past, these properties are managed by expert private real estate companies. This setup is designed to rake in substantial rental revenue for the state, which is then used to fund public services, meaning they don't have to tax the working class. And that brings us to our final pillar, Section 5, Projected Blueprint Outcomes. So, what's the grand result of all these gears turning together? The author projects some absolutely massive systemic changes. Because the state is aggressively building and funding infrastructure, they claim this will trigger virtually unlimited job creation. And since the government is now the nation's biggest landlord and factory owner, state revenue is projected to skyrocket, crucially without raising taxes on everyday citizens. By guaranteeing local housing, they essentially subsidize low-income work by killing commute costs. Ultimately, by providing permanent state jobs in both manufacturing and agriculture, the blueprint promises a living wage for all, a stabilized workforce that enhances national security, and the systematic dismantling of economic inequality. Taking a step back, you can really see how this entire text is a complete conceptual pivot. It's a highly detailed map for steering South Africa away from free market dynamics and foreign capital and steering it straight into a heavily centralized, state-managed ecosystem. The absolute most important thing to take away from this blueprint is how interconnected it all is. It's like a giant puzzle. The housing supports the factories, the state land ownership supports the farm workers, the massive real estate portfolio funds the infrastructure. Every piece relies entirely on the others. This blueprint theoretically aims to solve massive unemployment and housing crises through an unprecedented level of centralization. But, when you really look at these architectural plans for an economy, you have to ask, how feasible is a pivot like this in the real world? Can state ownership on this massive scale actually engineer away inequality? Or does it just introduce a whole new set of unforeseen systemic vulnerabilities? It's absolutely a structural question worth pondering. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.